A family's secret recipe book was lost in a fire. 60 years later, a chef buys an old pot. The story was supposed to end in ashes, but some secrets are preserved by the very flames that seek to destroy them. What was hidden in that pot wasn't just a recipe. It was a ghost waiting to be reborn in a new kitchen. Nona Isabella's kitchen, back in 1962, was less a room and more a sovereign nation of scents and flavors. It was a sanctuary built of simmering tomato sauces, the sharp perfume of freshly chopped basil, and the comforting soul of rising dough. She ruled this small kingdom not with an iron fist, but with a worn wooden spoon, conducting a daily symphony of taste that told the story of her family. Her movements were a dance, a ritual passed down through generations. Each chop of the knife and stir of the pot, a prayer to those who had cooked in the same way before her. It was a sacred space where the outside world and its troubles simply melted away. At the heart of this sanctuary was the book. Its cover was made of worn, dark leather, soft to the touch like an old friend's hand. Its pages, yellowed by time and stained with the ghosts of ingredients past, held more than mere instructions. Beside a recipe for bratzu, Isabella had scribbled notes about a neighbor's new baby. Next to the instructions for her famous wedding cake, she had noted the day her husband finally fixed the leaky roof. The book was a living document, a diary written in flour and olive oil, chronicling the small victories and quiet heartbreaks that composed the symphony of their lives. Isabella's philosophy was simple. Food was the one true language of the family, a dialect everyone understood. A rich polenta could mend a fractured argument. A delicate biscotti could celebrate a good report card. And a simmering pot of minestrone could offer solace in times of grief. She taught that every ingredient had a purpose beyond flavor, that rosemary could sharpen a memory and that a pinch of saffron could brighten a dark mood. To cook from her book was to speak this language fluently, to communicate love and history in a way that mere words never could. It was her most precious inheritance. Observing this magic with wide, adoring eyes was her granddaughter, little Sophia. She would sit for hours on a small wooden stool in the corner, a silent apprentice, memorizing the rhythm of her grandmother's hands as they kneaded, chopped, and stirred. Isabella would often look over, a soft smile on her face, and say, "One day, all this will be yours. But you must promise me you will listen, Sophia. You must listen to what the food has to say." The promise was a solemn vow, a sacred trust passed from one generation to the next, sealed with the scent of garlic sizzling in warm oil. Of all the tools in her kitchen, Isabella's most trusted confidant was a heavy copper pot. It was a wedding gift. Its surface now a map of countless family meals, marked with the dents and scratches of a well-used life. This pot had simmered sauces for baptisms, braised meats for wedding feasts, and boiled broths for winter colds. It seemed to hold the warmth of every laugh and absorb the sorrow of every tear shed in that kitchen. To Sophia, the pot wasn't just an object. It was a silent member of the family, a keeper of all their culinary secrets and whispered confessions. The fame of Isabella's cooking was a local legend. Neighbors would often find excuses to knock on the Rossi's back door around supper time, drawn in by the magnetic pull of the aromas wafting from her kitchen. They spoke of her magic touch, a mystical ability to turn simple ingredients into something transcendent. They didn't know the secret wasn't magic, but the book. It was a wellspring of ancestral knowledge, a guide that allowed Isabella to infuse every dish with the love and wisdom of all the Rossi women who had come before her. The recipes were the foundation, but the history was the soul. The night the memory burned began with the comforting sounds of a family finishing their meal. Laughter echoed in the dining room, the clinking of forks against plates, a familiar and soothing melody. It was an evening like any other, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The air was filled with the lingering scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, a testament to another successful family dinner, another moment of simple, shared happiness that would soon become a cherished and painful memory, the last of its kind for a very, very long time. Then, the first wisp of smoke, an unwelcome guest, snaked its way under the kitchen door. The smell of burning wood quickly overpowered the aroma of the meal, and the laughter was replaced by confusion, then by sharp, panicked cries. The world dissolved into a chaotic blur of shouting voices and the terrifying roar of the growing fire. In the pandemonium, the family scrambled to get out, their only thoughts on survival, on escaping the suffocating heat and the encroaching darkness that threatened to swallow their home whole. The order of their lives was instantly shattered into a million pieces. Once outside in the cold night air, a horrifying realization struck Isabella. It wasn't the house, the furniture, or the photographs. It was the book. Her heart seized with a pain far worse than any burn. Her entire being, her history, was in that kitchen. "The book," she screamed, her voice raw with a despair that no one else could fully comprehend. She tried to run back inside, a desperate primal instinct to save the very soul of her family, but her son held her back, his arms a cage of reason against her overwhelming grief as she fought against him. They stood together on the lawn, a helpless audience to the destruction of their world. They watched as the flames, like greedy orange tongues, licked at the walls and devoured the roof. consuming not just wood and plaster, but decades of shared memories. Every flicker of the fire was erasing a piece of their identity. Every collapsing beam was a chapter of their story turning to ash. Sophia held her grandmother's hand, feeling the tremors of a loss so profound it felt as though the world itself was ending in that fiery inferno, leaving them adrift in a sea of smoke and sorrow. The morning after was eerily silent. The rising sun illuminated a scene of utter devastation, casting long shadows over the skeletal remains of their home. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt memories. Amid the rubble, the heavy iron safe where Isabella kept the book was visible. Its door warped and twisted open by the intense heat. It was empty. The fire had taken everything. Its hunger so absolute that not even a single charred page remained. Was a void, a black hole where the heart of their family used to be, a stark and silent testament to their immeasurable loss. The fire left a scar that went far deeper than the physical loss of their home. In the new house, the kitchen was modern and sterile, and it remained quiet. Isabella tried to cook from memory, but the joy was gone. The recipes in her mind were ghosts, pale imitations of the vibrant life they once had on the page. Without the book, her hands felt like strangers in her own kitchen. The loss of that leather-bound collection of pages was not just the loss of instructions. It was the loss of her voice, the silencing of a conversation that had spanned generations of Rossi women. In the decades that followed, the Rossi family rebuilt their lives, but a permanent emptiness lingered at the center of their gatherings. Food became mere sustenance, a necessary function rather than a joyful celebration of life and togetherness. The rich, soulful flavors that had once defined them were replaced by a blander, more ordinary existence. The stories that were once told through food were now just faint echoes, spoken of in hushed, nostalgic tones, a reminder of a time when their family had a taste, a distinct and irreplaceable flavor that was now lost to them forever. Sophia, now a woman with children of her own, spent years trying to resurrect the ghost of her grandmother's cooking. She would stand in her kitchen, closing her eyes and trying to recall the exact scent of a particular spice or the precise texture of a certain dough. But her attempts always fell short. There was always a missing ingredient, a secret technique, a subtle nuance that her memory couldn't grasp. Each failed dish was a fresh wave of grief, a frustrating and painful reminder that the soul of their family's culinary legacy had been incinerated on that terrible night. For the younger generations of the Rossi family, the story of Nonna Isabella and her legendary book of recipes became a piece of folklore, a myth passed down at bedtime. They grew up hearing about the magical dishes and the kitchen that was the heart of the world, but they could never taste it. The book was a lost treasure, a family heirloom they had never seen, and the flavors it described were as fantastical to them as a dragon-s fire or a fairy-s spell. It was a beautiful but tragic tale of a paradise that had been lost long before they were ever born. To help pay for the new house, the family sold what little could be salvaged from the fire. Most of it was scrap metal and charred furniture, worth next to nothing. Among the items sold for a handful of coins was the old copper pot. It was blackened by soot, its shape distorted by the heat, with a deep, ugly dent in its side. It was unrecognizable, a scarred veteran of the fire that had taken everything. It was sold to a junk dealer and disappeared. Its silent knowledge and storied history forgotten, destined to fade into obscurity in the back of a dusty shop. Sophia, now a grandmother herself, would tell the story to her young grandson Leo. He would listen, captivated, as she described the aromas and the magic of Nonna Isabella's kitchen. To Leo, his great-grandmother and her lost book were characters from a distant, almost imaginary past. The stories filled him with a sense of wonder, but also a quiet sadness, a longing for a connection to a family identity that he had only ever heard about in stories. He felt the weight of the missing piece of their family puzzle, a void he didn't know how to fill. Over time, a sad resignation settled over the family. They came to accept that their unique culinary heritage was gone for good, a relic of the past that lived on only in the fading memories of the oldest generation. The Rossi table was still full, but the soul of the food was missing. They learned to live with the ghost of flavors they could no longer create, accepting that the most delicious chapter of their family's history had been abruptly and permanently closed. Its final words written in smoke and ash. In the present day, we meet Chef Alex. He was a culinary star, the owner of a restaurant praised for its flawless technique and beautiful presentation. But beneath the success, Alex was deeply unfulfilled. He felt a profound disconnect from the food he was creating, a sense that he was merely assembling ingredients rather than telling a story. He yearned for an authenticity he couldn't find in his own pristine, stainless steel kitchen, a soulfulness that his perfectly executed dishes seemed to lack. He was a master of his craft, but he felt like an imposter. Alex firmly believed that the most powerful ingredient in any dish was its history. He was convinced that true culinary genius wasn't found in modern gadgets or exotic foams, but in the echoes of the past. This belief led him to become an avid collector of antique kitchenware. He would spend his days off hunting for old cast iron skillets, carbon steel knives, and worn-out baking pans, convinced that these objects retained a piece of the soul of the cooks who had used them for decades, a tangible connection to the stories they had helped create. His obsession was a ritual. Every weekend he would lose himself in the dusty aisles of flea markets and the cluttered corners of antique shops. It was a treasure hunt for him, but he wasn't looking for monetary value. He was searching for objects that spoke to him, pieces that had a palpable weight of history about them. He would run his hands over the worn surfaces, imagining the countless meals they had prepared, the families they had nourished, and the secrets they had silently witnessed over the long years of their service. This quest for authenticity was fueled by a growing creative crisis. He felt trapped by the relentless demands of modern gastronomy, which seemed to prioritize innovation and aesthetics over genuine emotion and soul. He was tired of deconstructed classics and Instagram-worthy plating. He felt that the culinary world in its pursuit of perfection had lost its heart. This feeling was a constant, nagging void, a hunger for something more meaningful that his own award-winning cooking could not satisfy. The breaking point came in the form of a review from a highly respected food critic. The review praised his technical skill, calling his food flawless and a masterclass in precision. But then came the final, devastating line. "It is a perfect meal, but it has no heart." Those words struck Alex like a physical blow. They confirmed his deepest fears, articulating the very emptiness he felt in his work. The criticism wasn't just about his food, it was about him. It sent him into a spiral of doubt and creative despair. Driven by a desperate, unspoken need for change, Alex closed his restaurant for a week. He got in his car with no destination in mind, simply driving to escape the pressure and the silence of his own soulless kitchen. He drove for hours, leaving the city behind and finding himself on the quiet back roads of the countryside. He eventually pulled into a small, forgotten town. And that's when he saw it. A small antique shop. Its windows clouded with dust, looking as if it had been waiting just for him. The inside of the shop smelled of old paper, dust, and the slow, patient decay of time. Weak sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. The place was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures and discarded memories, with furniture, books, and household items stacked in precarious towers that reached toward the ceiling. It was a cemetery of stories, where every object seemed to hold a silent testament to a life that had long since passed, waiting for someone to come and listen. Alex wandered through the narrow aisles, a sense of disappointment beginning to creep in. It was all the same old stuff he'd seen 100 times before. Tarnished silverware, chipped china, and rusty farm equipment. Nothing called to him. Nothing held the spark of history he was so desperately searching for. He was about to turn and leave, convinced that his impulsive trip had been a complete waste of time, just another dead end in his frustrating search for meaning. And then, he saw it. Tucked away under a pile of flimsy aluminum pans, almost completely hidden from view, was the dull gleam of old copper. It was a pot, but it was unlike any he had ever seen. It was dark and tarnished, covered in a thick layer of soot that spoke of a dramatic, violent past. A large, distinctive dent marred its side, looking less like damage and more like a profound scar, a mark of survival against incredible odds. It was imperfect, and in its imperfection, it was beautiful. He reached for it, and as his fingers closed around the handle, he felt a strange, inexplicable pull. The pot had a weight to it that was more than just its physical mass. It felt heavy with history, with untold stories. It was an odd sensation, as if the object had its own gravitational field, drawing him in. He stood there for a long moment, just holding it, feeling a connection that he couldn't explain, a sense of recognition for something he had never seen before in his entire life. The shopkeeper, an old man with eyes that had seen decades of such transactions, shuffled over. "That one's been here for ages," he said, his voice raspy. "Came from an estate sale many years ago, part of a lot from an old house that burned down, the family who owned it. They say the woman of the house was quite the cook." The old man's words hung in the air, adding another layer of mystique to the scarred object in Alex's hands. The story, though vague, resonated deep within him. Without a moment of hesitation, Alex bought the pot. He paid the old man a handful of bills, not even bothering to haggle over the price. The amount was insignificant. He felt as though he had just discovered something priceless, a treasure that no amount of money could truly buy. On the drive home, he didn't put the pot in the trunk. He carefully placed it on the passenger seat, buckling the seatbelt around it as if he were transporting a fragile living person rather than a simple piece of discarded cookware. Back in his own kitchen, the copper pot looked like an ancient relic in a modern museum. It stood out against the gleaming chrome surfaces and the cold, efficient lines of his state-of-the-art equipment. The contrast was jarring. His kitchen was a space of sterile perfection, designed for technique and precision. The pot was a thing of chaos and history, a vessel of emotion and memory. It felt completely out of place, and yet, Alex knew instinctively that it was exactly where it needed to be. It was the missing piece. He began the process of cleaning it with the reverence of an archaeologist restoring a priceless artifact. He didn't use harsh chemicals or abrasive sponges. Instead, he used a gentle mixture of lemon and salt, slowly and patiently working it into the tarnished surface. He spent hours rubbing away the decades of grime and soot, his movements careful and deliberate. It was a meditative process, a way of getting acquainted with the object, of listening to the stories held within its scarred metal. As the layers of blackness began to recede, the pot's true characters started to emerge. A rich, warm copper glow reappeared, crisscrossed with a web of fine scratches and small dents that told the story of its long and busy life. The large dent on its side remained, a permanent reminder of the fire it had survived. Alex found himself tracing the imperfections with his fingers, imagining the hands that had held it before him, the meals it had created, the family it had served. He was no longer just cleaning a pot. He was communing with its past. This was not just about restoration. It was becoming an obsession. Alex abandoned all his other work. His restaurant remained closed and his phone went unanswered. His entire focus narrowed to this single object. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't creating something new from scratch. He was uncovering something old and important. He felt that the pot held an answer to the emptiness he had been feeling, a key to the authenticity he so desperately craved in his own life and work. As he worked, he talked to the pot, whispering questions into the air of his silent kitchen. Who did you belong to? What stories could you tell if you could speak? He felt a growing conviction that this was no ordinary piece of cookware. It had survived something terrible for a reason. It had waited for decades in the dusty corner of that shop for a reason. And he, a chef who had lost his way, had found it for a reason. The pot wasn't just an object to be used. It was a puzzle to be solved. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself unexpectedly. He was polishing the heavy base, a thick, solid piece of copper, when his fingers brushed against a barely perceptible line near the edge. It was a seam so fine that it was almost invisible, perfectly flush with the rest of the surface. He ran his finger over it again. It wasn't a scratch. It felt deliberate, like the work of a master craftsman. His heart began to beat a little faster. He had cleaned hundreds of old pots, but he had never seen anything like this before. At first he dismissed it as a maker's mark or a quirk in the design, but the thought nagged at him. The seam ran in a perfect circle a few inches from the pot's outer edge. It was too precise to be an accident. A wild, improbable idea began to form in his mind. He grabbed a thin palette knife from his toolkit and carefully, gently, tried to work the tip into the hairline crack. He felt a slight give, and then he heard it, a soft but distinct click. The sound of a hidden mechanism releasing after 60 years of silence. With his breath held, he lifted the outer layer of the base. It came away in his hand, revealing a hollow, hidden compartment beneath. It was a false bottom. Alex stared in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. An old fire-damaged cooking pot had a secret compartment. The shopkeeper's words echoed in his head. The woman of the house was quite the cook. He realized he had stumbled upon something far more profound than an old kitchen tool. He had found a secret. Inside the small, dark space lay a small package, wrapped carefully in what looked like oilskin cloth to protect it from moisture. His hands trembled slightly as he reached in and lifted it out. It was surprisingly light. He placed it on the clean countertop and slowly, carefully, began to unwrap the brittle, time-worn fabric. He felt like he was trespassing, uncovering a secret that was never meant for him. The air in the kitchen felt heavy with anticipation, thick with the weight of a 60-year-old mystery. As the last layer of oilskin fell away, his heart sank a little. The contents were not a pristine, hidden treasure. Instead, he found a small stack of paper fragments, their edges blackened and curled by intense heat. They were incredibly fragile, and it was clear they were the remnants of pages that had been burned in a fire. It seemed the secret compartment had protected them from being completely destroyed, but it had not been able to save them from the flames entirely. It looked like a pile of lost causes. But as Alex looked closer, his disappointment turned into a jolt of excitement. Despite the damage, he could see faint lines of elegant, looping handwriting on some of the larger fragments. The ink was faded, but it was still legible in places. He carefully picked up one piece. He could make out a few words. A pinch of saffron for the sun, ... double quotes, and, slowly, with love. It wasn't a letter or a diary. He recognized the language, the specific cadence. These were the charred, broken pieces of recipes. He spent the rest of the night hunched over the fragments, using tweezers to handle the delicate pieces, a magnifying glass to read the faded script. It was a painstaking process, a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. But he was consumed by it. He could decipher ingredients: rosemary, anchovies, San Marzano, tomatoes, and snippets of instructions. He felt a powerful connection to the unknown woman who had written these words, a fellow cook whose passion had literally survived the fire. The more he read, the more he understood. This was not just a collection of recipes. It was a masterpiece. The notes were personal, the instructions filled with emotion. This was the work of someone who didn't just cook food, but who poured her entire soul into it. Alex knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had not just bought an old pot. He had become the custodian of a lost legacy, a ghost of a kitchen that was now calling out to him, asking to be brought back to life. The story held within that pot reminds us that the things we lose are not always gone forever. Sometimes, they are just waiting in the quiet corners of the world for the right person to find them. What piece of your own family's history do you wish you could rediscover? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories that feed the soul, and ring that notification bell, because you never know when the past will decide to serve up a new secret. His kitchen, once a temple of minimalist precision, was now a chaotic laboratory of historical gastronomy. Alex began the impossible task of bringing the fragmented recipes back to life. He would lay out the charred pieces like a sacred text and attempt to fill in the vast empty spaces with his own knowledge and intuition. The first attempt was a simple tomato sauce, based on a fragment that mentioned only San Marzano tomatoes. Simmered for 4 hours. The result was good, but it felt like his own creation, not hers. It was missing a key element. He tried again, this time with a recipe for a lamb stew. The fragment mentioned rosemary and a single anchovy for depth. It also contained a cryptic note in the margin. For when the north wind blows. Alex thought about what that meant. A dish for a cold day. Something to warm the bones. He added ingredients he felt belonged there. Root vegetables, a splash of red wine, a bay leaf. He let it simmer, not for a set time, but until the aroma in the kitchen felt right, until it told him it was ready. He was cooking not with his eyes, but with his senses. The moment he tasted it, everything changed. The flavor was unlike anything he had ever created. It was rich and complex, of course, but it had something more. It had a profound sense of warmth, of history, a taste of a place and a time he had never known. It tasted like a memory. In that single spoonful, he felt the presence of the woman who had written the recipe. He was not just cooking her food, he was having a conversation with her across the decades, a dialogue without words spoken only through flavor. This single taste ignited his obsession into a roaring fire. One dish was not enough. He had to unlock them all. He worked tirelessly, sleeping only a few hours a night on a small cot he set up in the corner of his restaurant's dining room. His pristine chef's whites were replaced by flour-dusted clothes, his face perpetually smudged with soot from handling the delicate burnt fragments. The world outside his kitchen ceased to exist. Suppliers, staff, friends, all their calls went unanswered. His life had narrowed to a single all-consuming purpose. His kitchen became a beautiful mess. Charts with deciphered ingredients covered the stainless steel walls. Pots with experimental concoctions bubbled on every burner. The air was a permanent, intoxicating blend of simmering stocks, toasted spices, and baking bread. He felt more alive than he ever had behind the sterile line of his award-winning restaurant. He wasn't performing for critics or customers anymore. He was on a sacred quest, an archaeological dig into the heart of a family's soul, and the artifacts were made of basil and garlic. He felt as though he was slowly resurrecting the spirit of the pot's previous owner. With each recipe he managed to piece together, a clearer picture of her emerged. She was resourceful, using humble ingredients to create profound flavors. She was emotional, with notes about cooking for loved ones who were sad or celebrating. She was a genius, a master of a culinary language he was only just beginning to understand. He was no longer just a chef. He was her apprentice, her student, 60 years too late, but learning from her just the same. But his skills could only take him so far. Too many of the fragments were the elegant handwriting lost to the consuming fire. The secrets of her most complex dishes remained locked away in the charred, brittle paper. He would stare at a fragment for hours, able to make out only a word or two, the rest a black, frustrating void. He knew he was missing crucial steps, the small details that elevated her cooking from merely good to transcendent. He had hit a wall, and his intuition was no longer enough to break through it. He realized, with a heavy heart, that he needed help, not from another chef, but from someone who could read the stories that the fire had tried to erase. His search led him to a name spoken with reverence in academic circles. Dr. Alistair Finch, a paleographer and expert in the restoration of damaged historical documents. He was a man who spent his life coaxing secrets from burnt scrolls and waterlogged manuscripts. Alex knew it was a long shot, but he gathered the precious fragments and made an appointment. Feeling like a supplicant approaching a high priest, Dr. Finch's office was the polar opposite of Alex's kitchen. It was a place of monastic quiet, smelling of old leather and acidic paper. Every surface was neat, every book perfectly aligned. Finch himself was a small, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of academic detachment. He listened to Alex's story with a thinly veiled skepticism, his expression unchanging as the chef passionately described his quest. To Finch, these were not sacred relics, they were simply damaged cellulose, a routine technical challenge. Alex carefully laid the fragments out on the polished mahogany desk. Dr. Finch leaned in, examining them under a bright lamp with a practiced, dispassionate eye. He poked gently at a piece with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers. "Extensive carbonization," he murmured, more to himself than to Alex. "Significant water damage as well, likely from the fire being extinguished. The ink is iron gall, which makes digital recovery a possibility." He agreed to take on the project, not out of any sense of romance, but because it presented a suitably difficult puzzle for his intellect. Weeks passed with no word. Alex tried to busy himself in the kitchen, but the work felt directionless without new information. He felt adrift, waiting for a verdict that would decide the fate of his quest. Finally, a call came from Dr. Finch's office, summoning him. When Alex arrived, the paleographer had a single sheet of paper waiting for him. On it was a list of words and phrases that his technology had managed to pull from the blackened fragments. Most of it was still culinary terms, but then Alex saw it. Near the bottom was a single, clear word: Rossi. It was the first real clue, a tangible link to the family who had owned the pot. For the first time, the ghost had a name. Alex felt a surge of triumph. Rossi, he repeated the name to himself. It felt right. He could almost picture Nona Rossi standing in her kitchen, stirring the copper pot. Dr. Finch, unimpressed by the chef's emotional reaction, pointed to another recovered snippet. It was part of an address, a street name, but the town was missing. And next to it, the date, 1962, confirming the year of the fire. Alex's elation quickly faded as the reality of the task ahead set in. He returned to his restaurant and typed Rossi into a national database. The screen filled with thousands upon thousands of entries. It was one of the most common Italian surnames in the country. His single precious clue was a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. He spent days scrolling through names, trying to cross-reference them with the partial street address, but it was a hopeless endeavor. The broadness of the search was overwhelming, and despair began to set in once more. He felt foolish. He had a name, but it was a name shared by countless strangers. He had a pot and a handful of half-burnt recipes, but he was no closer to finding the family, to understanding the full story. His obsession had led him to a dead end. He started to question everything. Maybe he was just a crazy chef, chasing a ghost story he had invented in his own head. He looked at the copper pot, its warm glow now seeming to mock him, a silent keeper of a secret he'd refused to share completely. His quest felt doomed. Just as he was about to give up, another call came from Dr. Finch. The academic's voice was different this time, tinged with a hint of actual curiosity. "I've found something rather peculiar," he said. "It's not part of a recipe. It was written on the very edge of a page, in a different ink, as if it were a last-minute thought." He had managed to isolate a few words from a fragment that was almost entirely ash, using a new multispectral imaging technique. The words were unusual, a strange and poetic phrase. Alex rushed back to the university. Dr. Finch showed him the enhanced image on a large computer screen. The ghostly letters seemed to float out of the black background. Alex read them aloud. Near the little church with the broken angel, the phrase hung in the air, beautiful and mysterious. It was not a street address or a town name, but it was something far better. It was a landmark, a unique, specific image that could be found. It was a clue straight out of a fairy tale, a beacon of hope in a sea of uncertainty. The new clue reignited Alex's passion. This was the key, a broken angel. It was the kind of detail people would remember, the kind of local quirk that might even show up in historical records or old photographs. He and Dr. Finch, now an unlikely but effective team, combined their clues. They had the general region where the pot had been sold decades ago, and now they had a very specific, very unusual landmark to look for within that geographical area. The impossible search suddenly had a clear, defined target. Alex's research shifted from genealogical databases to historical archives. He spent weeks poring over old county maps, local historical society newsletters, and digitized collections of church directories from the mid-20th century. He searched online forums where local historians shared information. He was looking for any mention, any photograph, of a church with a damaged statue of an angel. The work was tedious and slow, a meticulous process of eliminating one small town after another. He faced countless dead ends. He found churches with angels, but they were all intact. He found broken statues, but they were of saints, not angels. Days turned into weeks, and his hope began to wane again under the sheer weight of the search. He sat late one night, bleary-eyed, scrolling through a grainy, poorly digitized archive of old town photographs from the 1950s. He was about to close the browser when he saw it, a small black and white photo labeled Portanovo Town Square. In the background of the photo, behind a group of children playing, stood a small stone church. And there, above the arched doorway, was a statue of an angel. Its left wing was clearly and distinctly broken off, just a jagged stump of stone remaining where the wing should have been. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the image, his heart pounding in his chest. He had found it. The broken angel was real. The church was real. After months of searching, his quest finally had a destination. He felt an electric jolt of certainty. He was close, incredibly close, to finding the home of the Rossi family and the kitchen where his pot had once simmered. Portanovo, the name of the town, felt sacred. He looked up its location. It was a small, quiet place, a few hours' drive away, nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, a town that seemed to have been passed over by time, the perfect place for a 60-year-old story to be sleeping, waiting to be reawakened. He knew what he had to do next. This was not something that could be handled over the phone or by email. He needed to go there himself. He needed to stand in front of that church, to breathe the air of that town, to walk the same streets the Rossi family might have walked. He carefully packed the most complete of the restored recipes, and then, with the utmost care, he wrapped the copper pot in soft blankets and placed it securely in his car. He was not just a chef anymore. He was a pilgrim, and he was about to make his journey to the source. The drive to Porto Novo was a pilgrimage into the past. As Alex left the highway and turned onto the winding country roads, he felt as if he were crossing a threshold into another time. The town, when he finally arrived, was exactly as the old photograph had suggested: quiet, charming, and seemingly untouched by the frantic pace of the modern world. Stone buildings lined the narrow streets, and the air was clean and smelled of damped earth and blooming flowers. It was a place where stories could easily sleep for 60 years, undisturbed by the noise of progress. He parked his car and walked toward the town square. His heart was a drum against his ribs, and then he saw it. The small stone church stood at the head of the square, a silent, stoic witness to the town's history. He looked up, and his breath caught. There, above the heavy wooden doors, was the angel. Its stone face was weathered by decades of sun and rain, and its left wing was missing, a jagged, poignant stump reaching for the sky. It was real. Every doubt, every fear that he had been chasing a fantasy, evaporated in that single, confirming glance. He spent the first few hours simply absorbing the rhythm of the town. He sat at a small outdoor cafe, nursing a coffee, listening to the conversations of the locals. He was an outsider, and he knew that barging in with a wild story about a magical pot and a ghost chef would be met with suspicion. He needed to be patient, to listen. He asked the cafe owner, a friendly woman in her 70s, about the history of the church. "Oh, the broken angel," she said with a fond smile. "It's been like that as long as anyone can remember. Some say it happened in a storm, others say it was damaged in the war." He gently steered the conversation, asking about old families in the town, particularly those of Italian descent. "If you want to know about history," the woman said, wiping down the counter, "you need to talk to Leo Moretti. His grandmother's family, the Rosses, were one of the oldest families here. He knows every story this town has to tell." She gave him directions to the small local historical society, a one-room museum that Leo ran as a passion project. The name Rossi struck Alex like a bolt of lightning. He had found his connection. The historical society was a dusty, charming room filled with faded photographs and forgotten farming tools. Behind a large wooden desk sat a man in his late 30s, with kind, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet concentration. This was Leo. Alex introduced himself simply as a chef interested in the region's culinary history. He began by asking general questions, carefully circling the true purpose of his visit. Leo was polite but reserved, answering Alex's questions with the practiced patience of a man used to dealing with curious tourists. Alex knew he couldn't delay the truth any longer. He took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He spoke of his creative crisis, the antique shop, the pot, the false bottom, and the burnt fragments of the recipes. As he spoke, he watched Leo's expression change from polite interest to guarded suspicion. The more fantastic the story became, the more Leo's brow furrowed. By the time Alex mentioned the broken angel, Leo was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, a look of profound skepticism on his face. "The Rossi fire," Leo said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It's the great tragedy of my family's history. My grandmother Sophia, she was just a girl when it happened. She lost everything." He paused, his gaze hardening slightly. "It's become something of a local legend. I've heard many stories, many exaggerations over the years, but a secret compartment in a pot, Mr. Alex, with all due respect, that sounds like something out of a novel, not real life. My family's pain is not a treasure hunt." Alex understood. He saw the fierce protectiveness in Leo's eyes, the duty he felt to guard his family's painful past from what he likely saw as a fanciful, opportunistic stranger. Alex knew that no amount of explaining or pleading would convince him. Words were not the language that this story was written in. He had to speak the language of Nona Isabella herself. "I know how it sounds," Alex said calmly, "but I can prove it. Let me cook for you. Let me cook one of her recipes. Then you can decide if I am telling the truth." Leo hesitated, a flicker of curiosity warring with his skepticism. The sheer conviction in the chef's voice was unsettling. What if he was telling the truth? And if he was, what would that mean? He looked at this stranger, this man who claimed to have a direct line to a past that Leo had only ever heard about in stories. Against his better judgment, he found himself agreeing. He knew of a small community hall with a kitchen that could be used. "One dish," Leo said, his voice firm. "You cook one dish, and then we will see." Alex worked in the small, unfamiliar kitchen with a focused intensity. He chose the recipe for the lamb stew, the first one that had truly spoken to him, the one that tasted of a cold wind and a warm hearth. He didn't have the famous copper pot with him. He had left it safely in his car, but he channeled all of his focus, all of his reverence for Isabella, into his work. He cooked, not from memory, but from a deeper place, letting the spirit of the recipe guide his hands as he chopped, seasoned, and stirred the rich, fragrant stew. He presented the single bowl to Leo without a word. The aroma filled the quiet hall, a scent that was both rustic and incredibly complex. Leo picked up his spoon, his face still a mask of skepticism. He took the first bite. The change was instantaneous and profound. His eyes widened slightly. He took another bite, slower this time, his movements becoming thoughtful, almost reverent. A look of deep, confused recognition washed over his features. He wasn't just tasting food, he was tasting a ghost. "My grandmother," Leo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "When I was a boy, she tried to make this dish. She would stand in the kitchen for hours, her eyes closed, trying to remember. She never got it right. It was always good, but it was missing something." He looked up at Alex, his skepticism completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe. This is what it was supposed to taste like. This is the memory she was chasing. How is this possible? The proof was not in the story. It was in the flavor. The wall between the two men crumbled in that moment. Leo was no longer a gatekeeper, but a believer. He was overwhelmed, flooded with a mix of joy and a deep, ancestral sadness. The ghost of a flavor he had only ever imagined was now real, a tangible link to the great-grandmother he had never met. He peppered Alex with questions, his earlier suspicion replaced by an urgent, almost desperate need to understand. He finally understood that Alex was not a treasure hunter, but a messenger from the past. He knew what he had to do. "You have to meet my Nona," Leo said, his voice filled with a new energy. "You have to meet Sophia. She is the only one left who truly remembers that time, who remembers the kitchen, the book, and the pot." He warned Alex that his grandmother was old, and that the memories of the fire were a source of deep, lifelong pain. It would have to be handled with the utmost care and gentleness. This was not just about solving a mystery anymore. It was about healing a wound that had been open for 60 years. They drove to a small, neat house on the edge of town. An old woman sat in a comfortable chair by a window, a book resting in her lap. This was Sophia. She had the same kind, intelligent eyes as her grandson, but hers were clouded with the mists of time and memory. Alex felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. He was about to disturb the quiet waters of this woman's life with a relic from her most traumatic memory. Leo made the introductions, explaining that Alex was a chef researching the region's history. Alex sat with her, speaking gently, not as an investigator, but as a fellow admirer of her grandmother's art. He didn't mention the pot at first. He spoke of the recipes, of the respect he had for the woman who had written them. He described the notes he had found in the margins, the little human touches that made the recipes so much more than instructions. Sophia listened, a sad, gentle smile on her face, her eyes distant, as if she were looking back across a vast ocean of time to the warm, fragrant kitchen of her youth. Finally, the moment came. With a nod from Leo, Alex went out to his car. He returned carrying a heavy object wrapped in blankets. He knelt before Sophia and slowly, carefully unwrapped the copper pot, placing it on the floor in front of her. The afternoon sun coming through the window caught the warm, polished metal. Sophia stared at it, her expression unreadable at first. She leaned forward, her frail hand hovering over the pot, not quite touching it. It wasn't the restored shine or the familiar shape that she recognized, her eyes fixed on the large, ugly dent on its side. The scar. A single, silent tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek as she reached out and laid her palm flat against the dented copper. "The fire," she whispered, her voice a fragile breath of sound. "I remember this. It fell from the hook. It was the last thing I saw before the smoke became too thick." She was not just touching a pot. She was touching the last moment of her childhood. The dam of 60 years of suppressed grief broke. Sophia wept, deep, shuddering sobs of loss and of reunion. She ran her hands over the pot's surface as if it were the face of a loved one long thought dead. She was a young girl again, back in the sanctuary of her grandmother's kitchen, safe and surrounded by the aromas of home. Leo knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet with tears. Alex watched, feeling like a humble witness to a moment of profound and sacred healing. The pot, a silent survivor, had finally come home. It had carried its secrets and its sorrows through the long, quiet decades, waiting. It had waited for a chef who had lost his soul to find it, for a historian who had lost his connection to believe in it, and for an old woman who had lost her past to reclaim it. The journey was not about finding a collection of recipes. It was about returning a piece of a family's heart that had been torn away by the flames so many years ago. The pot of Nona Isabella reminds us that the most important stories are not written in books, but are engraved in the objects we love and in the memories we share. The true flavor of life is in keeping these connections alive. What is the secret recipe of your family? Share a memory in the comments, subscribe so you don't miss any stories, and click the bell, because there is always a new secret to be discovered. After the initial wave of intense emotion subsided, a quiet, wonderful peace settled in Sophia's living room. The pot sat in the center of the room like a guest of honor, its warm copper glow seeming to fill the space with a gentle, forgotten light. Then, the stories began to flow. Holding the pot's handle, Sophia's eyes would glaze over as she drifted back through time. She spoke of her grandmother's hands, always dusted with flour, She described the specific sound the pot made when simmering a Sunday ragu, a low, happy gurgle that was the soundtrack of her childhood. These were not just memories of food, they were memories of life. She pointed to a small scratch near the rim and recalled the time a young, clumsy uncle had dropped it while trying to steal a meatball, much to Isabella's feigned anger and secret amusement. The pot was a key, unlocking a library of memories that Sophia herself didn't know she still possessed. Alex and Leo listened, captivated, realizing that the burnt fragments they had recovered were merely a table of contents to a much richer, more vibrant story that had survived only in the heart of this remarkable woman. Each story added another layer of life to the recipes Alex had been trying to resurrect. A simple biscotti recipe was no longer just a recipe. It was the one Nona Isabella made for Sophia to take on the long boat journey when she visited relatives as a girl. A hearty bean soup was what she prepared for the farmhands during the autumn harvest. The food was inseparable from the love, the community, and the moments it was created for. Alex understood that to truly recreate the food, he had to understand the life it was a part of. The presence of the pot did more than just unlock memories. It reawakened a deep, dormant hunger in Sophia, a hunger for the tastes of her youth, for the flavors of home that she had long ago resigned herself to having lost forever. A quiet determination began to burn in her eyes. It was not enough to simply remember. She looked from the pot to Alex, a silent question passing between them. The memories needed to be made real again. They needed to cook. The story couldn't end in her living room. It had to return to its rightful place, the kitchen. Leo, seeing the new spark in his grandmother's eyes, made the arrangements immediately. The community hall kitchen, which had witnessed the first taste of proof, would now become their sanctuary of reconstruction. They transported the copper pot with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. Placing it on the stove was a ceremony in itself. For the first time in 60 years, the pot was back where it belonged, ready to be filled, ready to simmer, ready to tell its stories not in words, but in aromas and flavors that would bridge the long gap of time. This new collaboration was a delicate dance between 3 generations. Sophia, too frail to do the heavy lifting, became the conductor of this culinary orchestra. She would sit on a tall stool, her senses as sharp as ever, guiding Alex's hands. She couldn't always remember precise measurements, but she knew the feeling, the look, the smell. A little more flour, Caro, she would say, watching him knead dough. It needs to feel like your earlobe. She would have him hold a sprig of rosemary under her nose to confirm it had the right potency. Alex, for his part, surrendered his ego as a celebrated chef. He became a humble apprentice, his technical skills now in service to Sophia's sensory memory. He learned to trust her instincts over his own training. If she said the sauce needed to simmer for another hour, despite what the clock said, he let it simmer. He was learning a new way of cooking, one that was based not on recipes but on a deep, intuitive conversation with the ingredients themselves. It was the final missing piece of his own culinary education, the ingredient he had been searching for heart. Their first great success was a complex multi-layered lasagna, a recipe of which Alex had only recovered a few cryptic burnt fragments. The notes mentioned a secret white sauce and the patience of a saint. With Sophia's guidance, they slowly rebuilt the dish. She remembered the secret ingredient for the sauce, a tiny pinch of nutmeg and a whisper of lemon zest. She remembered the specific way Isabella would layer the pasta, ensuring every corner was perfect. The entire process took them to full days of meticulous, loving work. When they finally pulled the bubbling, golden brown lasagna from the oven, the aroma that filled the kitchen was so powerful, so evocative, that all 3 of them fell silent. It was the scent of triumph, the perfume of a memory made real. Leo, who had been documenting every step, put down his camera, his eyes wide. Sophia closed her eyes, a blissful smile on her face, and simply inhaled, transported back to her grandmother's kitchen. It was more than just a dish. It was a resurrection. They had not just cooked a meal. They had brought a piece of the past back to life. They sat down together at a simple folding table in the middle of the hall. Alex served 3 plates with a shaking hand. The first bite was a moment of pure, unadulterated magic. It was perfect. The flavors were so rich, so deep, so full of history and love, that it was almost overwhelming. Was the taste of family, of home, of a legacy that had refused to be turned to ash. For Sophia, it was a homecoming. For Leo, it was a first meeting. And for Alex, it was the discovery of the very soul of food that he had been searching for his entire life. News of what was happening in the community hall kitchen began to travel through the small town of Porto-Novo. The incredible aromas wafting from the building did not go unnoticed. Leo's cousins, aunts and uncles, the scattered descendants of the Rossi clan, started hearing whispers. At first, they were skeptical, dismissing it as Leo's latest historical obsession. The story of the lost recipe book was a painful family legend, and they were wary of it being treated as a novelty. But curiosity is a powerful force. Leo decided it was time to share their success. He invited a few of his closest relatives, a gratant and 2 older cousins, for a small, private dinner. He told them only that he and his grandmother were working on a project to document old family recipes. He didn't mention Alex or the pot, wanting the food to speak for itself. The atmosphere was tense at first, the relatives guarded, unsure of what to expect from this strange endeavor that had so consumed Leo and their matriarch, Sophia. Alex served a simple meal, a small portion of the lasagna and a piece of rustic bread based on another of Isabella's recipes. The reaction was exactly as it had been with Leo. A hush fell over the table as they took their first bites. The gratin, a stern woman named Gina, put her fork down, her eyes welling with tears. "This is not possible," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have not tasted this since I was a little girl, since before the fire." The food had bypassed their skepticism and spoken directly to their hearts, to a shared memory they thought was lost. The dam of doubt broke, replaced by a flood of emotion and excitement. The relatives were no longer suspicious. They were believers. They crowded around Sophia, hugging her, asking a torrent of questions. They looked at Alex with a newfound respect, this stranger who had somehow become the keeper of their family's most precious secrets. The small dinner turned into a joyous, tearful celebration of rediscovery. The legacy was not just for Sophia, Leo, and Alex. It belonged to all of them, and they were ready to reclaim it. The project took on a new life and a grander scale. It was no longer a private quest, but a communal effort to rebuild their heritage. The family rallied, offering support and, more importantly, their own fragmented memories. A cousin would remember a story about a specific holiday cake. Another would recall the smell of a certain spice her father always talked about. These small, scattered pieces of oral history became crucial clues, helping Sophia and Alex fill in more of the gaps in the burnt book. With Leo meticulously documenting every step, they began to formally reconstruct the recipe book. It was a beautiful fusion of past and present. Alex would decipher Dr. Finch's findings and cook the recipe. Sophia would taste and correct it based on her memories, and Leo would type it all into a new document on his laptop, adding notes, family stories, and photos of the finished dishes. They were creating a new heirloom, born from the ashes of the old one, a testament to the resilience of their family's spirit. As they worked, Sophia began to share the most important secrets of all, the ones that Isabella had never bothered to write down. She explained that her grandmother believed the mood of the cook was the most important ingredient. "You must never cook when you are angry," Sophia explained to Alex. Isabella would say the anger gets into the food. She taught him the unwritten rules: how to listen for the sizzle in the pan to know when it was the right temperature, how to use the scent of the dish to know when it was perfectly seasoned, not just the clock or a measuring spoon. These were the true secrets of the Rossi kitchen. It wasn't just about ingredients and techniques. It was a philosophy. It was about infusing the food with love, with intention, with a piece of your own soul. Isabella believed the pot knew the cook's heart, and if your heart wasn't in the right place, the pot would refuse to cooperate. Alex, the technically perfect chef, absorbed these lessons with humility and awe. He was learning that the real magic in the kitchen didn't come from a recipe, but from a connection to the food itself. The pot of Nonna Isabella reminds us that the most important stories are not written in books, but are engraved in the objects we love and in the memories we share. The true flavor of life is in keeping these connections alive. What is the secret recipe of your family? Share a memory in the comments, subscribe so you don't miss any stories, and click the bell, because there is always a new secret to be discovered.